We have marked, at least I marked, that we're ready for on page number 22, question number 10, and this right is in the midst of the 13th chapter. We concluded last week with the concept of deferred hope, and that is you're looking forward to something, but it just seems like it ain't going to get here, and then when it finally does, then you're just overjoyed, and it's unbelievable how wonderful it is. But of course, if it never comes, then it tires you insides out. And of course, we tried to look at the disappointment that had to be felt by poor old Jacob when he worked all those 7 years, and he ends up with his sister-in-law instead of the wife that he wanted. I mean, his wife-in-law. Well, he got sister-in-law. I mean, how does that work anyhow? So he ended up with 2 wives, and that wasn't sufficient. He ended up having 2 other women that he had children by. And that's a whole other story, and the hazards of having more than one wife are carried out in those examples for sure. And so then in question number 10, we have this contrast that's made, or this comparison that's made, and a specific reference is made to someone's word. Whose word is it spoken of here? Of course, it's talking about God's word. And of course, parallel to that is whose commandment? Well, that's God's too. Ours, Richard. All right, then number 11. What do you think could be the reference to this phrase, the snares of death? Well, there's a lot of possibilities, but we know that it's put in opposition to what is made possible by properly applying wisdom. So whatever it is that's opposed to the law of wisdom, it could ultimately be death itself. It could be the calamities that goes along with not doing what God would have us to do, the suffering, the indignities that are the result of living a life that's given to that which is bad, the pitfalls that come your way when you're sort of fending for yourself and not paying any attention to what God says. Those are the types of things that would fit into that category. And of course, the way to avoid whatever it is to pay heed to God's wisdom as revealed in the Word of God. Then, of course, this is a passage that's, verse 15 is a passage we oftentimes quote. It has to do with the fact that the way of the transgressor is hard. Who are some Bible examples that would come to your mind right off the bat as to that being true just by their example? I mean, there's untold numbers of individuals who, because of their decision-making abilities, not being in accordance with God's will, then they ended up suffering. You go all the way through the Old and New Testament as well, including Ahab and Jezebel and Nadab and Abihu and Cain and Saul, King Saul and Judas and Herod and you name it, would fit in that category. And it is hard. Now, in what sense is it hard? It's not enjoyable, is it? Of course not. And even if there is a certain amount of satisfaction and pleasure attached to it, it's limited to the here and now. And so ultimately, it's going to be hard eternally for sure, as it relates to those who make that choice. Number 13, what's the difference between a prudent man and a fool, at least in this verse of Scripture? And it's sort of not obvious until you see the opposite, the fool and how he conducts himself, which leads to the conclusion that the prudent man is the one that actually thinks ahead. He actually plans for the future, but not the fool. The fool don't plan ahead at all. As a matter of fact, he might be guilty of bragging about what he's doing and thus showing his foolishness in not planning ahead for the future. Number 14, what is a wicked messenger? Wicked in what sense? All right, here's somebody you can't depend on. They're not telling the truth. They're unreliable. They're not being trustworthy to the person who is sending them to do a job. And of course, the contrast in this verse is the faithful ambassador, okay? In other words, here's the one that's carrying the message for someone in a position of authority, and they do it in a right way. You can depend upon them to do the right thing, but not the wicked messenger. Number 15, refuseth instruction is set in contrast to who or what? The person that regards reproof, that's a positive, obviously. The person that refuses to learn, that's the negative, okay? So a person that does not pay any attention when somebody actually tries to assist them in seeing where they've erred from whatever they're doing, they shouldn't be doing that, then that's a foolish person indeed. And a wise man will not refuse to be instructed. Number 16, achieving goals requires what on the purpose of the person that is achieving those goals? He has to do what? He has to work. He has to want to. He has to desire. He has to put forth effort in order for that to come about. If there is no desire, then you can forget about it, you know. One of the most glaring examples in my lifetime was when I was told I was going to have to study for a whole year New Testament Greek. Let me tell you something. If you don't want to learn Greek, you can't do it. It's impossible. And sometimes, even if you want to with all your little old heart, it's still very difficult, you know. And of course, some languages come easier to others, but I'm not going to mention anybody here in this class that speaks 10 languages fluently, like Roger, but it's hard. I mean, I've still got a hard road to hoe with English, much less any other language. Number 17, what is the message of verses 21 and 22? It's stated in the New Testament, maybe in a little more concise manner. What about who you run around with? If you've got evil companions, is that going to result in good? Well, of course not. It's going to corrupt your morals, corrupt your manners. And so, another closely related law of God is you reap what you sow. You know, you can't run with the hogs and not smell like a hog, for sure. So you have to be careful. And of course, this whole section is dealing with the instruction that a father would give to his son who should want to learn these lessons that very likely the father has learned by experience. And experience is a good teacher, but the consequences of experience are sometimes difficult to bear up under. Number 18, what sometimes happens to the wealth of the wicked? Who ends up with it? Righteous people do. Now, realize this is a proverb, okay? So it's not always the case. But how could it be from a practical standpoint that here is a wicked person who has a large amount of stuff, but a righteous person ends up being able to benefit from it? Well, most time we think about a wicked person, a person who has maybe gained his wealth in a wrong way, then you're thinking about somebody who's not really that careful to see to it that things are done on the up and up anyhow. He's taking advantage of a system, maybe taking advantage of people, and so he could very well be wasting away in prison while somebody else who's not wicked is able to use the resources that he has taken from somebody else, you know. So from a practical standpoint, that oftentimes is what happens. Number 19, what often happens to the wealth of the poor? Somebody says that don't even go together. How could there be wealth and a poor person? Are people, generally speaking, in our society today, are they poor because they don't have the resources to not be poor? Or are they poor because they squander what they've got, make poor choices, which keeps them in the position where they cannot rise above it because of the decisions they make? Well, most of the time that's it, you know. I was showing film strips to this woman and her two daughters one time. They were on, of course, they were on food stamps, and it just so happened that the day that I went to show film strips to them, they had got their food stamps, and they had gone to the store and they had bought T-bone steaks, you know. And they had a pile of T-bone steaks. They had, I mean, high-priced foods that I don't eat, you know. Had all that. Of course, was it any wonder that they ran out of food before the end of the month because they wasted it on stuff they really didn't have to have, you know? Well, that's oftentimes what's typical of people who waste or squander what they have. they're poor stewards. They don't have any planning abilities, and it's because they don't want to do any better that they don't do any better. I mean, it's so bad. There's one lady that used to call every week just about and want food, and she'd start down her list, you know, and she'd say, I want peanut butter, but I don't want that JFG. I don't like that. I want Peter Pan, you know. Number 20, how can we show our hatred for our children? If we do not discipline them, if we refuse to discipline, that's a good indication that we don't really care about our children. Number 21, what promise is made to the righteous? All right, he'll have sufficient to be satisfied. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that he wants, he'll have at his disposal. He may not be wealthy, but he'll have what he needs. And again, that's a principle. He'll have enough. If we have enough, then that should satisfy us. But sadly, you know, there's a little old bulletin line every now and then I'll see. It says, if you can't be happy with what you got, what makes you think you'd be happy with something more? You know, that's something that people have not considered. Excuse me. All right, chapter 14. What are the two contrasts that we read here in verse 1? All right, you got the wise man that is building, and you got the foolish man who's tearing down. And of course, here's that principle again that we've talked about before, the difference between a person who is actually industrious and in building something, maybe his own funds, maybe his own hands, that he takes pride in it and takes care of it. But if it's somebody else's and he just happens to be there for a while, then they don't appreciate it near as much, and so they don't take care of it. And of course, I think I even compared that to what I experienced in Russia. You know, when everybody's got exactly the same thing, nothing, then there really is no pride, because there's no such thing as keeping up with the Joneses, because everybody's a Jones and everybody's got the same thing, and that's nothing, you know. And nobody owns anything in those situations. Number 2, name some blessings of walking uprightly that are spoken of specifically here in verse 2. He possesses a what? A clear what? A clear conscience. And the clear conscience is the result of him knowing that his sins are forgiven, knowing that he can pray and he will have answers to his prayers. He'll enjoy fellowship with God. He'll have other benefits that are only available for the faithful, and that's the direct result of choosing to walk a righteous, upright life. Number 3, what is a characteristic of being perverse, as spoken of here in verse 2? If someone's perverse, they despise God and the counsel that God provides. In other words, they don't have any fear of God, thus what God expects, what God desires, then they have no time to even consider that. Number 4, what do you suppose the first statement in verse 3 actually means? In the mouth of the foolish is a rod of pride. Now sometimes I think we've got a saying that's very similar to that, as to the person who puts what in his mouth? Puts his foot in his mouth. I think that's sort of the idea here, of the person whose pride is running out the end of his foot, and in his boasting, he ends up sticking his foot in his mouth. You know, well, here it's a rod of pride. I think there's some translations that have, instead of rod of pride, it's called the staff of insolence or something like that. But it seems to me that's the same type of concept as your foot in your mouth. Number 5, what's the meaning of clean in verse 4? The crib is clean. What does that mean? Ain't nothing there to eat, right? It's empty. So if there is no food, then how well off are those animals going to be that you depend on? You can't make much money from the use of your animals if they don't have anything to eat. And so you end up not even having any animals to use, no oxen, no anything. Number 6, a common saying that finds reinforcement right here in verse 4 is as strong as an ox. And that's supposed to be a compliment. because it's not talking about smell, it's talking about strength. Okay? Number 7, that was a joke, by the way. Number 7, what are some of the reasons why some people bear false witness? Now, most time we don't boil it down to these things, but that's exactly the motivation for it. It's self-serving. It's a demonstration of a person trying to one-up somebody else by thinking they can bring them down by lying about what they do. Envy, jealousy, pride, covetousness are all the root causes for people bearing false witness oftentimes. Number 8, why does a scoffer have trouble learning? He won't listen. He has no desire to learn, as we've noted before. He's not teachable. You can't teach anybody anything if they're not teachable. And of course, that's one of the characteristics of little children that is held up as being so useful for us as children of God. Number 9, are there people who you judge to be wiser than they prove to be? That happens all the time, I mean, I've made that mistake, of being around a person for just a little while and jumping to the conclusion, boy, I tell you what, here in a couple of 3 weeks, this fellow needs to be an elder. And then 3 or 4 months later, you realize that would have been the dumbest thing we ever did, is made him an elder. Because it was a jumping to a conclusion. And of course, when you jump to a conclusion, that means you don't take in sufficient amount of facts to draw a proper discerning decision about matters, for sure. Number 10, what does prudent mean in verse 8? If a person is prudent, they know how to use their what? They know how to use their brain. They know how to use their mind. They are able to exercise sound judgment. Number 11, that how should be who. Who alone would mock at sin? The fool. The fools mock at sin. When you say, the devil made me do it, like Geraldine, Flip Wilson, I mean, that's mocking at sin. When you make light of something that can cause you to be lost eternally, you have to be a fool. And that's the way the Bible describes such an individual. Number 12, what is favor as it relates here in verse 9? If someone has the favor of God, what does that mean? He's got the blessings of God. He's got the acceptance of God. He's on the good side of God, and goodwill and fellowship exists between him and God. That's the type of favor that we all should desire. Number 13, how would you elaborate on verse 10? The heart knoweth his own bitterness, and a stranger doth not intermeddle with his joy. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to say that, but it basically comes down to we all face different types of joys and sorrows. And it's impossible for us to put ourselves in the same shoes as somebody else if we're not experiencing the same thing they are, So we have to leave people to enjoy their joys, and of course, and obviously as it relates to our responsibility as Christians, we are to weep with those that weep and rejoice with those that rejoice, for sure. And one of the things I've observed, it seems as though it's a whole lot easier to weep with those that weep than it is to rejoice with those that rejoice. I don't know why that is, but it seems like that's seems to be more capable. People are more capable of doing that than the other. Number 14, what is the triple contrast here in verse 11? Well, we got contrast. The house of the wicked is contrasted with what? The tabernacle, which is a dwelling place. Wicked is contrasted with upright, and overthrown is contrasted with flourish. So you really got antonyms here. You got the opposites being played out in this contrast. The house of the wicked is wicked, and it'll be overthrown. Well, now we naturally expect that, and the reverse would be true on the others. Number 15. What other verse in the book of Proverbs is a restatement here of verse 12? There's a way that seemeth right unto man, but then there are the ways of death. 16:25, exact same phrase is used. And that is a passage that we oftentimes use as a basis for saying just because you feel fine about a thing doesn't mean it's fine. It just means you feel fine about it. It doesn't say anything as to the correctness or the rightness of it. It just says what you think about it. Number 16, can you think of an incident in the Bible, in history, or in your own personal knowledge that illustrates verse number 12? Well, of course, the classic one that I always go to is in Acts chapter 26, verse 9 and 10, when Paul said, I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which things I also did. See? So Paul thought, Saul of Tarsus thought that he was doing what God wanted him to do when he was trying to stamp out Christianity. Of course, he wasn't, but he thought he was. So the end result of that type of attitude would have been his destruction if he had not repented and turned and become a Christian himself, for sure. Number 17, are there people who try to act happy when they really aren't? Or is life in reality a mixture of happiness and sorrow? What is this verse actually dealing with? The first or the last?
I think there's
It's really both. But this is probably talking about that life is full of both those things. You know, there's sadness and there's happiness in every person's life. And there are people who try to hide the way they're actually feeling. And of course, to a certain extent, we all do to a degree, or else we'll be walking around popping people in the nose all day long. You know, we have to hide some of our feelings for sure. And that'd probably be preferable instead of wearing your feelings on your sleeve, you know. Number 18, in the Bible, give an example of one whose mirth ended in heaviness. Again, here's the Bible is filled with examples. I mean, when you see mirth, that word mirth, I can't help but think of those that would be responsible for writing some of the songs and some of the Proverbs as well, a David or a Solomon, and the mirthful existence but then the foolish decisions they made, especially with women, and how it cost them so dearly, for sure. Jezebel would be another one as well who would fit in that category. Number 19, a backslider in heart is filled with his own ways instead of whose ways? God's ways, obviously. Number 20, at what stage of life is one most apt to believe every word? In childhood. And of course, the reason why is because when a person is a child, they are gullible, you know. And when a person is gullible and innocent and naive about things, then they don't have a firm foundation to reason about various things that come their way, and so they believe every word they're told, you know. And of course, that's something that we don't want to have that mentality ourselves as older people, but we do want to think the best of situations as we can and not twist it out of proportion, for sure. Number 21, what are some other examples in the Bible connecting fear with departing from sin? All right, when Jonah's message, yet 40 days, and then it was going to be destroyed, that was a fear-causing, rousing sermon for sure, which brought about a change in the people. Remember when Achan was caught, at the defeat at Ai, and Achan had to be exposed as taking of that which was not lawful for him to take, and ends up being stoned to death. Well, obviously here was a point that was made in his example that when God says something, He expects you to follow His instruction, or it's going to cost you dearly. In the New Testament example, Ananias and Sapphira, don't lie about your contribution. You know, there was nothing wrong at all with them saying we took a percentage of what we got, then we gave it to the Lord's church and the work here in Jerusalem, but they did not. They said they gave it all, and they was lying. Number 22, what does rageth mean? All right. Anger and bold expressions of anger. Of course, along with that, the disrespect that comes the way of the person who has this emotion. Number 23, who hates a man of wicked devices? Even his wife. Everybody does. A wicked person is disliked by everybody. At least should be. I mean, would you go in business with a wicked person? With a crook? Well, no, I wouldn't. I even heard people say this before. They said, now I wouldn't buy, and I've heard people say this about brethren, said, now I wouldn't buy a car from him. Now, wait a minute. If you wouldn't buy a car from him, then what has led you to the conclusion that this is a faithful brother? I mean, what is a contributing factor that has led you to the conclusion that you can accept fellowship with them, but you wouldn't buy a car from them? Something's terribly wrong in that view, it seems to me. Number 24, does life become better for the simple? And of course, the simple here is the innocent, naive person. No, it really doesn't. I mean, just because he doesn't know better doesn't mean it's better. It doesn't mean it's going to get any better either. He's just oblivious to the destruction that's going to come his way. He's whistling in the dark while certain calamity will result. Who are some Bible examples or Bible instances of this being the case? Verse 19. The evil bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. Well, the two examples I've got written here are the prodigal son and Simon the sorcerer. And that might be a stretch, but that's all I could. And honestly, when I was putting that question together, it was a brilliant question when I put it together. And then the more I look at it, the more terrible it is, which happens a lot of time in these questions. Absolutely. Old wicked Haman and his dastardly designs on eliminating all the kinfolk of Mordecai ends up resulting in his own demise for sure. Number 26. Why do people not want to be companions of those who are extremely poor? You can be used by them. It can end up rubbing off on you to a certain extent. And that's not good. Number 27, do you see in verse 21 a man despising his neighbor because he's poor, or is the first clause to be so limited? Is he despised because he's poor? He that despiseth his neighbor sinneth, but he that hath mercy on the poor, happy is he. Well, who's the person that has mercy on the poor? Well, he's the person that assists the person out of his poverty. Okay? So, despising a poor person because they're poor, the circumstances under which the person is in that position has a whole lot to say about how we should feel about the individual. And if we're going to err, obviously, and of course, anybody that has been around very long at all knows how many times we've been duped and deceived into providing assistance to people who lied through their teeth and no more were in need of assistance than anything else in the world. So I've used the example, we had a policy at Dunlap where, and I may have told you this, we had a policy where any of the deacons, elders, or me could spend $100 buying food, but we'd go with the people who needed food. So here's a young couple, got two little old snotty-nosed kids. I go with them to save a lot, help them pick out the right kind of stuff to eat. and I feel so good about what I've done. And then the very next day, as I'm going by up the road in a triangle where they always have a flea market, there was the car of that couple with the trunk open, and all of those groceries that I'd helped pick out were being sold at a flea market to buy component parts for meth. Well, now, that was one time that my countenance was kept in check, and I did not kill that couple. But I sure wanted to wring their necks for sure. So somebody looks at a situation like that and says, well, you can't trust anybody, we can't help nobody. Well, that's not the right attitude either. You do the best you can. You'd rather err on being too giving than being stingy and not actually helping somebody that really needs to be helped, for sure. Number 28, what would be an illustration of devising evil? It just means making a plan to do something that's wrong, you know. That's it. That's it. That's for sure. That would fit that perfect example. Number 29, those who devise good have what on their side? All right, they are truly working in accordance with God's will and righteousness, and so they're planning to do that which is right. Number 30, what does penury mean? Or penury? My dictionary said it was destitution. Penury is destitution. So, in all thy labor there is profit, but in the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. In other words, all the talking in the world ain't going to get you out of a destitute situation. You got to actually engage in something and not talk your way out of it. Number 31, what is meant by crown in verse 24? The crown of the wise. The glory, the reward, the result that comes the way of the righteous is a crown. And of course that lends itself to the idea of being a part of a kingdom as a servant of the king and all that goes along with the rights and the privileges of the kingdom of God, for sure. Number 32, a true witness delivereth souls from what? From destruction. And of course, if you're picturing a court of law in which here's the truth that's coming out, the person who is actually innocent, by you testifying in his behalf and getting to the truth of the matter, then you're going to make sure that injustice doesn't result, for sure. Number 33, how is fear used here in verse 26, as it oftentimes is in the Old and the New Testament? Respect, reverence, the quality of not wanting to let God down because of all that he's done for us. Number 34, what is meant by a fountain of life? Of course, a fountain is the source from which water comes, right? So a fountain of life would be the source from which spiritual sustenance in life comes. And that, of course, is the idea here. If we want to tap into the source of our true sustenance, then we have to tap into the Word and the will of God. Number 35. What could be a synonym for want? In verse 28. In the multitude of people is the king's honor, but in the want of people is the destruction of the prince. All right, the idea of a limited amount, scarcity, not many, that's the idea, I think, here of wanting maybe. Number 36, can you think of any illustrations of hasty in spirit and the result being exalting folly? All right. I mean, any instance in which a person is led and promoted in what he does by emotion, pure emotion, then he's going to more than likely jump to conclusions, not going to be based upon facts, and so the results could very well be not well thought out, and the hastiness of the situation certainly will lend itself to making an error, for sure. Number 37, what is a sound heart? The word sound, as it's used both in the Old and New Testament, has to do with health. Has to do with health, a healthy heart, a healthy state, proper circulation, plumbing is not stopped up, all that. Number 38, what passage in Matthew does verse 31 remind you of? Is that right? Huh. Does it stop at verse 37? I mean, number 30. Well, don't worry about that one then. All right, so is 39, what is the righteous person's hope when death comes? All right, what is a person's hope when death comes? The resurrection from the dead. He has much to gain. There is obviously rest from their labors. Their works do follow them. So here's comfort, refuge, and integrity that is available for the person who righteously dies. Number 40, what is the meaning of resteth? Verse 33. Resides. Has a home in the understanding person. Number 41, trace the truthfulness of verse 34 in the up and down history of Israel. Do what? How much time we got? Yeah. The book of Judges, that's one point, obviously. But of course, you got 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. You got land of Canaan, you got judges, then you got kings, you got a united kingdom, a divided kingdom, Assyrian captivity, Babylonian captivity, return to Palestine. So obviously, there were some very low points, but there were high points as well during that period of time. Number 42, what is the double contrast in verse 35? The king's favor is available for who? The wise servant, for sure. But the king's wrath is bestowed upon the foolish person. And of course, the shame that goes along with the foolishness is telling as well. Chapter 15. Here's another one of those double contrasts, a verse that we're well familiar with. What is the double contrast? A soft answer does what? Turns away wrath. But grievous words stirs up anger. Right? So here's if you don't answer, but use, if you're not answering in a useful, constructive type of way, then don't be surprised if there is not anger and maybe even a fist fight that will result. Number 2, does fools here mean simpletons or unwise in verse 2? It's not talking about the simpleton or the naive or the young and innocent person. Here it's contrasted with the wise, so it has to be the unwise. An unwise person is a simpleton. And again, the context is the only thing that would help us to draw that conclusion. Number 3, what other passages besides verse 3 show either the omnipresence or the omniscience of God? Well, I mean, you don't have to, it's hard for you to just bring all that to memory. Mars Hill and Paul's sermon on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. You know, God's not very far from any one of us. He wants to be found. We should seek Him, and He can be found. And many other passages illustrate the same thing. When we say omnipresence, what do we mean? He's everywhere all at the same time. When we say omniscience, that means He knows everything. He knows everything there is to be known. Number 4, the breach of what spirit is referred to here in verse 4. Perverseness is a breach in the spirit. What is the person? What is the spirit here referenced here. Of course, the individual spirit has to do with who he is, his personality, his character traits, his attitudes. And so here's a person who's perverse, then that affects who he is. You know, it affects how people think about an individual like that. Now, most of the time we wouldn't say he's got a breach in his spirit, but that is the figure that's used here by Solomon. Number 5, what other passage besides verse 5 speaks of despising instruction? Well, there's a bunch here, even in Proverbs, chapter 13, verse 1, chapter 13, verse 18, which we've already noted. Number 6, what other passages are there that regard reproof? Well, again, we've already covered those, 12:1, and then, of course, remember Paul's instruction to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. So there has to be reproof even in the communication of God's will to man. Number 7, who was a righteous man in the Bible who was rich? There sure is one. And another one I would say would be Job too. Number 8, who was a wicked man in the Bible who was rich? All right, Ahab, obviously, as a head of state, he had a significant amount of wealth, not enough wealth that he could talk Naboth out of his vineyard for sure. But there's a whole lot of wicked people who had money. But it wasn't because they had money they were wicked. They were wicked in spite of the fact that they had much resources available to them. Number 9, what does disperse mean? All right, to spread, to distribute widely. Number 10, what makes a sacrifice mentioned in verse 8 abominable to God? All right, so you mean that worship has to do something with the character of the individual who is engaging in worship? Well, sure it does. Sure it does. The wicked life of a person who's attempting to worship God doesn't discount because he's attempting to worship God as wickedness, for sure. It's not like some people think, you know, as long as you show up and sit in a pew for a few hours, then that cancels out all the wickedness you've done. That's not the way the Bible pictures it. It's impossible to be a true worshiper while walking in wickedness. Number 11. What is the comparison in verses 8 and 9? The difference between two different types of worshipers. You got a true worshiper, and then you got somebody that is not a true worshiper. A true worshiper has always been one who worships the Father in spirit, and worships the Father in truth. And when you got any of those three characteristics lacking, you ain't got true worship. And since God seeks such to worship Him, then that means that anybody and everybody that is accountable to God can be a true worshiper, if that's what their desire is. Number 14, forsaketh what way? The way of wisdom, the way of God, the way of the knowledge of God's will. Number 13, what is hell or Sheol? It's basically a general definition. The after-death world, okay, is Hades, the invisible world, the place of departed spirits that we see illustrated in the account that Jesus gives us, a rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16. Illustrates it well. Number 14, is there a relationship between a scorner's not loving to be reproved and his not being wise? Well, sure. You know, if he does not want to be corrected, then that evidently means that he's satisfied in his foolishness. Because if he was desirous of wisdom, then he would delight at someone helping him get there. We're simply talking about a person that's unteachable here by choice. Number 15, what characterizes a cheerful countenance? If a person has a cheerful countenance, sometimes we say he's got a what? A merry heart. A merry heart. He has a happy disposition. Demeanor is happy. Number 16, what characterizes a broken spirit? a sad or a sorrowful heart. Obviously, just opposite. Then, of course, if a person has a broken spirit because of sin, is that the kind of spirit they should have? Yep. So they'll do something about it, you see. Number 17, why does a man of understanding seek knowledge when people who are sadly deficient in understanding don't? That's it. But he's demonstrating that he's a man of understanding because he knows he can always learn more, you know. The more you study, the more you know there is to know and to learn, and you never get to the point where you say, well, I've arrived at complete and thorough knowledge. Never happens. We always need more. Number 18, what is meant by the mouth of fools feeding on foolishness? Now, if you're talking about the diets of these two different individuals in contrast, you got the wise person whose appetite is for the truth, is for the will and word of God, where the appetite of the foolish person is a different diet entirely. It's worthlessness, foolishness. And of course, ultimately, it can be classified as wicked. That oftentimes spews out. Number 19, what does evil mean here in verse 15? Just the other word for wicked, depraved. No day seems good to such an individual. Number 20, a continual feast of what kind is this referred to? Here we're picturing this contrast between the positive outlook person and the negative outlook person, the one that's feeding his soul with that which is good and feeding his soul with that's not good. And so here the picture is a person who every day is living and seeking to live with a merry heart and taking a positive view of things. And there's the word that we oftentimes use, blessed or blessed, like in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 or in the first Psalm, you know. The idea of it is contented happiness despite outside circumstances, you know. Now, that's easy to say, you know, but contented happiness and satisfaction regardless of what's going on around about you. Have we all got there yet? Not hardly. Maybe if we live to be as old as Methuselah, we'll get closer. But I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it that long. Once again, we've got a wonderful place to stop because the time has run out on us. Number 21, Lord willing, we'll pick up right there on our next meeting time.